Okay, I'm just gonna say a little bit about the book, and then we'll see what Eleanor has in mind to grill me on. But so the Bootleg Coal Rebellion. This is about a place northeastern and central Pennsylvania in the anthracite coal fields, which most people, when you think of coal, you're probably thinking of bituminous coal, which is what's in most of Appalachia or Appalachia, depending on where you're from. And I know why am I going to get new geography right away? It's important for understanding it. So regular bituminous coal, flat like this, anthracite coal, kind of like accordioned like that, right? And so what that meant was when the coal mines started closing during the Great Depression and shortly before that, the miners had access to these little seams poking out in the mountains. And they started digging their own coal mines, and more and more of them did it. There were thousands and thousands of these bootleg mines until just so much of the mining industry had retreated and abandoned the area, and so many people were bootlegging that it became, for two counties at least, their primary source of income on the whole. And then they began working in broad daylight. There were bootleg truckers who were taking the coal, selling it from Connecticut all the way up to Connecticut, all the way down to Maryland. And at the time, this was used for home heat. This was oil, nobody could afford it yet, and electric heat wasn't a thing yet. So this is how the East Coast heated their homes. And at its peak, the bootleg miners all together were putting out as much coal as the largest coal companies, and selling it for $1 or $2 less a ton than company coal. And I don't know, I didn't waste words in the book, right? So it's hard to sum up all this different stuff, but there's so much confrontation, there's so much attitude. I really wanted to capture what it felt like for them, not just this happened, then that happened kind of thing. And just there, yeah. It's again hard to decide what to sum up. Eventually, though, the book kind of has an ending for 1942. It's because World War II comes in, all these people are listed as unemployed, so the young ones are drafted, and then war industry comes in, refurbishes factories to make things to kill people in Europe. So that soaks up other people. And after the war, people do come back and keep bootlegging, but you have to end a book somewhere. And also, it was never as big as it had been during the Depression. And while there were plenty of confrontations too after the war, there were never as many confrontations. There was a lot of, not as many confrontations as the Depression era. There was a lot of bootleg miners versus strip mining machinery, which they blew up about a dozen times. This happened. A lot of fighting off the coal and iron police, the private police force with the power of the state. And they also held truces with the state police. Basically, as long as they didn't shoot anybody, the state cops weren't going to come in. Yeah, I don't know. There's so many examples of mass actions that happened in ways that I've never heard of before. And so it's amazing how, I guess, proud I feel to know that this is the people I came from, even though I didn't know that until I started researching this book. So leave it with that. Eleanor.
Yes, thank you, Mitch. And I agree, you don't waste words in the book. So it is a powerful read and an incredibly researched read, which can sometimes make it feel really dry and academic, but it certainly does not. And so that was it was a pleasure to read, and also really radical to hear these stories that, of course, you won't hear in history books. You won't hear anything in a book. You won't read in history books. I apologize. I'm getting over a cold and my brain's a bit foggy. But I wanted to touch on a main part that hit me as soon as I started reading it, because it's something that I highlight when people ask me about the documentary that I did about West Virginia, which was when people ask, what made you want to tell these stories? And I'm like, okay, sorry to get into the semantics, but I'm not telling these stories because they're not mine to tell. I'm inviting folks whose stories these are to tell them. And this is kind of an interesting intersection because they're your stories in the sense that it's your history, but of course you weren't there. And so I found it so powerful that you did such an amazing job of bringing in primary sources, i.e. the voices of bootleggers themselves, their families, the community members. And it felt to me using that as a starting point and then filling in the rich details and contextual surroundings. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that process of centering the bootlegger voices themselves, as well as your own personal history that's intertwined in the story.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this book is about people in the present as well. You know, there's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of descendants. There's also still a few people who mine coal in this manner, though they do it with property rights most of the time, leases and things, you know. And so I didn't want to, like, I could have framed this book ideologically I could have framed it through an anarchist ideology, you know, and made it seem like a something that was on the road to utopia. I could have framed it as a communist thing or something like that, but that's not who, well, some of the people were communists or anarchists, but that's not who the people were on the whole. And so the story of the story of the stories that I have, the story of the interviews that I have, is that there was a man, Michael Kazura, in the late 80s and early 90s, who's the son of bootleg truckers, and he was working on a book about bootleg coal mining. He went around, interviewed all the remaining bootleg miners from the Depression that he could find, but he got in a car accident and died before he did much of his writing. And I managed to track down his widow, who was thrilled to share with me all the material that she had been keeping in her basement, hoping one day somebody would want. All these people, by the time I started researching it, are dead and gone, you know? And so this is like such a valuable resource. And, you know, like right off the bat, you would think like, okay, a bunch of coal miners interviewed in their 80s, they're going to have certain attitudes, but they were like all over the place politically. They were extremely honest, you know, like willing to share things that are sensitive, you know, lamenting different things, missing people, all sorts of things. And so like listening to all those and then starting to jump into the research of newspapers and government reports and things like that, you know, making those things intersect accurately was really, sometimes I'd have to write out a whole story and then delete the whole thing, you know, and start over because I made too many assumptions. I didn't even know I was making them sometimes, you know. But so yeah, but then from there, it was just really, I kind of took this is my process. I kind of took the quotes from the interviews and categorized them, and then used that plus a timeline to line up how the story goes, you know, which, you know, chronological isn't how people remember things really, you know, but yeah, I don't know. It's just been, like when I have to go back and look for a quote that wasn't in the book or something, I just get lost in rereading some of the things I had transcribed from these interviews. You know, they're just really unique people with a unique attitude. So.
Which I think comes across really well, and it's actually thank you for coming up with the segue for my next question, because I think kind of like a huge red thread, or perhaps even a larger theme in the book, is how organizing seemed to come naturally. It seemed like an organic evolution based on the communities folks were a part of. And you actually write in the intro, quote, "Bootleggers didn't see the world through one specific ideology. They were radicalized and became bolder by their own actions. It was rooted in their own history, traditions, and circumstances," end quote. And it also, I mean, it reminds me of something that I encountered when I was in West Virginia too, and speaking to folks that were talking about the mine wars. And, you know, one woman in the film actually says, well, they weren't communist Reds. Well, maybe some of them were. Like, but it didn't matter because that wasn't the point. The point wasn't their ideological like labels. It was that they were part of these communities. And I think that this can be a snag that organizers catch themselves on these days, that like, oh, the ideological label matters, and we have to make sure we're organizing with these folks, or we have to turn these folks into we have to convert people. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that organic radicalism of folks in bootleg country and the solidarity between not just miners, but like all walks of community members, even sometimes judges, and what this says about grassroots organizing as opposed to top down, which we see a lot today.
Yeah, that's a hell of a question. So luckily I wrote a book about it. But so these people have a history of unionism, that some of that union activities that they did is like a big part of national union history, you know, because like I said, East Coast gets all their heat from the anthracite at this point. So people paid attention in 1902 and the 1920s when there were major strikes and things like that. And one of the big lessons that was learned through like union efforts failed and failed and failed for decades there, until they finally learned the lesson of like working beyond their ethnic groups, you know, and by doing that, they were finally able to organize the whole region from Scranton to the southern part of the region. And that was the only way they were able to win their union fights. So people remembered that there was like a loyalty to the union that didn't mean people were always active or even paid their dues or anything like that, but it became the way they do things, you know, like we need to make something happen. We need to deal with the problem. I'm not just going to go talk to the boss, you know, I'm not going to file a petition or whatever. I'm going to get everybody together first. And that was also, I don't mean to say they were like totally communal or anything like that, you know, but they also had their experiences of being in their churches, being in social clubs and things like this. And so when it came time to organize a bootleggers union, which actually got started in like a dozen different places at once, all within a year or so of each other, they just did it how they did it already, you know? They did it in the union way. They did it in the social club way. They got together, they elected their people or whatever. They argued things out with each other. And it's, you know, so in the interviews, there's a few prominent communists, and the communists are pushing for this kind of organization before it happens, but the communists don't end up being in charge of it or the only ones pushing it. But in the interviews, you know, again, the 80s, 90s, I remember one guy in particular, like not wanting to out anybody as a communist. You know, he'd say, oh, he'd get up there and he'd talk about communism, but who am I to say if he was a communist or not? You know, because some of those people then in the Red Scare, like one man got deported to a country he hadn't lived in, I think. If I had that correctly. And then with like the Republican and Democratic parties, I have some of this stuff in the book too. At the time, it was basically machinery. And so people were affiliated with different parties, mostly based on who they had to deal with. You know, there were certain cops who said, we'll leave you alone if you vote whichever party. And so the loyalties were all over the place, you know, but at the end of the day, you know, the communists didn't mind in communist minds. They were integrated just with everybody else because they were the same people as everybody else. And so when there was an accident, when somebody's life was on the line, communist, conservative, whoever, they had to work together to save somebody, you know, and there was a lot of respect for the communists in particular for always wanting to show up for the fights, for the literal fights, you know, or being the first to stand up for people. But they also really didn't like the communists going on and on about atheism. That was like the big pet peeve. Nor were they interested in like having their bootleg unions pass motions referring to like US foreign policy, you know? So, you know, the communists, sometimes they were better at things and sometimes not as good at connecting with people. But the process of forming bootleg unions and fighting off cops, and then like over time, like through trial and error, finding like, oh, this way works better than this way for doing things. They just grew more and more militant. You know, the first time somebody refused to come out of a coal hole when the company was going to blow it shut, that it's made people, you know, like that was a moment for everybody, not just the person who said, whatever, blow it shut, you know, you're going to kill me anyway if you shut this thing. And then the first time miners surrounded and blew up a strip mine shovel that was going to destroy their coal holes, you know, that was a moment for everybody. Now, fast forward to them being interviewed years later, it's funny, you know, all of the Schuylkill County people say, oh, the Northumberland County bootlegger miners, they were the radicals over there. You know, and Northumberland County says the same thing, like, oh, Schuylkill County, they were the radicals, you know, but that's because they're not thinking about the things that they did as radical. They're thinking about the things they did as necessary. Interesting note, the Communist Party officially didn't do a whole lot with the bootleg miners, because from their perspective, the bootleg miners had already figured out their solution, you know. They supported them a lot, but yeah. Anyway, the self-radicalization is pretty fascinating. And also, I mean, so coming at it from an organizing mindset, like, people aren't linear, like left and right aren't even like concept useful for most people and how they think, you know, in dividing different issues into different categories. And so if you're gonna try to organize a bootleg miners union, you start with talking about bootleg mining. You don't start with religion. You know, you don't start with political affiliation. You don't set up qualifiers, because the whole point of the union is that you need everybody in there. And there were fights and arguments. There were like, this isn't in the book, but there were like a few murders over like you know, who owes who money, things like that, that weren't like high up in the union. They were like, it wasn't like that. But yeah, they didn't, this is a thing I keep saying, but they didn't get along with each other any better than we do today with our neighbors or coworkers. You know, they just knew that, they knew through experience that that guy over there, he's an asshole, but like, I sink or swim with him, you know? And then touch on another part you mentioned about judges, right? Because bootleg coal money was what was keeping everything afloat, and everybody knew that. Well, everybody knew that, like the middle class of these towns, if you even call it that, maybe the merchant class is a better term, that they knew that that's what was keeping their businesses open too, right? And the bootleggers never formally like did anything electoral, but judges and people running for office would try to come speak at the bootleg union meetings, you know, and they'd let, well, shouldn't say it's universal. This is the thing with making assumptions, you know. I know some bootleg unions would like let any politician come. They could talk for a couple minutes if they wanted to, you know, and then they wouldn't endorse anybody. But I don't know that every union did that. Yeah, when they had good dealings with the governor, the particular Governor Earl, and he came and took a tour of the bootleg mines, and he wanted to go down one, so they let him go down, but they didn't tell him any of the like basic safety knowledge you need to get down it, you know, and so he got all banged up, and they just thought it was so funny, even though he was like obviously their ally, you know. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you have to have some fun. Well, I also, you know, speaking of organizing, I think it's interesting because the book in and of itself is a bit of a, I mean, I don't want to necessarily say a call to action, but a call to action in the sense that like learning your radical history is a way to radicalize the present, and a way to understand a direction for the future and consider everything from tactics to, you know, like you're talking about, like, we're just as, you know, we're just as difficult these days as they were back then. And yet they understood we have to work together for this common goal. So I was curious too, like the book as an organizing tool, particularly since you've released it. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Yeah. So it's part of a larger thing that I've been doing with this group, Anthracite Unite. Kind of the idea is that nostalgia often works against us as organizers, you know. Nostalgia, people think about the old days and they remember what they want to remember. There's a story about Centralia, the town that is on fire. A lot of people have heard of that town, where there were like two routes to deal with that in the town. You know, one was we want the government to pay us to get the hell out of here, and the other one was we want the government to fix it so we can stay here, right? And it was bitter. And when it's all said and done, the people who stayed had really bitter memories. You know, they remembered half of their town turning on them and leaving. And the people who left got very nostalgic. They remembered what a great town it used to be. And again, like they only moved like 5 miles away, you know, but still, there was all this nostalgia. And I remember opening my eyes one time talking to somebody who used to live in Centralia, being like, we had drugs, we had everything, you know, we had all the problems, you know, like divorce, people fighting, you know, like it, not to say it was a bad town or a good town, you know what I mean? But nostalgia makes people remember things in a different way. That's been an issue in Hazleton, Pennsylvania too, where years ago there was this big anti-immigrant bill passed in Hazleton, which is a strange place. Long story why it was happening there. It eventually became like a statewide and national thing elsewhere. But yeah, there was all this like nostalgia for how it used to be and how safe things used to be. And it was just absolute bullshit, you know? Like, and people knew it. Like if you talk to them about specifics, you know, that town, it's always been a rough town, you know, the town always been a mix of immigrants, you know, and there's some people who like the like newer Dominican and Mexican population being there because mariachi sounds like polka. You know what I mean? It reminds them of the old days. But anyway, so to the point of the book, though, is this history has been almost completely forgotten. There's very few people who like know little chunks of this. The thing that's lived on the most is actually their methods, like the DIY ways they did stuff, just because, again, there's about 3 deep coal mines left, which are all family mines. I went down one 2 winters ago with the people, and there were only 2 miners and 1 guy up top, you know, and they're still using these same methods. They're just paying whoever owns the property to lease it. So they have all that kind of knowledge has been passed down, but like the militancy and just the turbulence has largely been forgotten. And so what people, and I'm not like calling anybody specific out, but what we generally do then is like paint a generic narrative of what, oh, things were tough, but our people were tougher, so we're good. You know what I mean? They grew some vegetables, you know, like, which they definitely did. I mean, all those things are true, right? But actually, like people in these 2 whole counties survived that decade by fighting the police, blowing up company property, stealing company property, stealing almost anything that wasn't nailed down, and you know, fighting a political battle to keep the state police out of those counties, right? And so, you know, when told through this history, and I've done several events out in these towns already, it's like my priority to do as many events in these towns as I can. Yeah, I say, like, you know, our ancestors did illegal shit to survive, and they used violence when they felt necessary, and whether it's like always justifiable in pure moral sense, like that's who these people were, you know. And so like from that, that's a foundation which you can build solidarity with other people, right? So the bootleg truckers, a lot of them who came from Baltimore were Black, you know. I don't know how many. I would love to know more about this, but it was hard to find more info. But I just wonder, like, what if those connections had lasted, you know? What if those, like, oh, you know, my family and your family, you know, we survived that together, if that had run down through generations, you know, how would the anthracite region respond to the murder of Freddie Gray? You know, would it just be an abstract political thing on TV, right? And so they're like, putting out this book isn't an explicit organizing project. I wish there was some like campaign that dovetailed real nice that I could work into events and stuff, but there's not right now. But it is like a foundational thing, the way I see it. And also, I've I've probably had like 150 people come out to events total, and people are really proud of it. People are really I mean, there's a lot of things that, like, depending on your vantage point, are very questionable that the bootleggers did, and people are unconcerned with that. Yeah.
As they should be. I mean, a friend of mine used to say it's easy for people to question tactics when they're sitting on the couch and you're in the shit. So I think that's and yeah, and I think like the DIY aspect is really, really rad as well. Not just the tactics that they use to keep themselves safe, their community safe, but the tactics that they use to just get it done. And another thing that I think was so great is because they really tried to go through the proper channels, right? Like they tried lobbying, they tried asking nicely, and they had, as you put in the book, like they had this thing like, just reopen the coal mines and we'll stop. Like, we're not just doing this for shits and giggles. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that DIY aspect and how this kind of started as a way to survive and like just like picking little coal bits, and then turned really into an entire movement.
Yeah, so it has just historically been a thing that children and the elderly would pick coal off the refuse banks, the comm banks they're called, and during strikes people would do that as well, and that snowballed into being bootlegging in its way. But yeah, people were inventive, right? By this time, it's hard to remember different periods of coal history at different times, but the newest collieries or coal mines had machines that could pick train cars up and turn them upside down and dump them out, right? That's the level of technology they're working with. The bootleg miners they have some hand tools. They have some hand tools and a spot in the mountain where they're pretty sure if they dig for a month, they can find some coal, And so they worked with everything they could. They raided the closed collieries, the company mines, for parts. This is shortly after like the trolleys system went defunct, so they ripped up all the trolley tracks and everything like that. There was a lot of theft of, I don't know, one funny one is burlap sacks. Lots of farmers were getting their burlap sacks burglared because, it's easier to fill the sack with coal and carry it somewhere. The crown jewel of it all, is on the cover of the book, which is that they took Model Ts, which at this point are old enough to be kind of cheap, take one wheel off, hook a wire or cable up to it, and then, put it in reverse to send the bucket down, put it in drive to pull it back up again. And actually the independent miners who I just talked about from like 2 winters ago, they were still using a motor hooked up to a winch. It was more elaborate than that one. It was like a Chevy 350 engine, but but it was still the same setup. But they were, there's lots of safety aspects that are important. I mean, that's the knowledge of mining isn't just how do I get the most coal out. It's 75% of the knowledge is how do I do it without dying, right? Or severe injury. And so there were places where the mines where they connected them all underground so that they could power one fan on one side and one fan on the other and ventilate all the mines at the same time. They were using like gutters from water pipes to hook that up to a fan and push it down in. And since I'm mentioning fans, funny thing about electricity that really pissed the companies off is they were paying for electricity. They were getting hooked up by the power company. And in the photos I found, you see like cable wire coming in from somewhere. But you know, they didn't always have that. Like there were some miners were setting coal stoves at the bottom of a shaft so that they burn coal, heat it, the air, and it would travel upward and create a draft that could pull in air from a secondary opening. But you know, that was also dangerous, as was linking their mines. That was also dangerous, you know. There's cases where there's so many bootleggers in the same spot that they would all chip in to hire one of them as the safety inspector who would go check each mine every day, you know, things like that. Yeah, it really gets quite elaborate. And everything I'm talking about, there's 7,000 different bootleg miners, give or take. So I'm generalizing because it's not like they all went to a class or a meeting and decided how to do all these things, you know. One mine would try something, people would see how it worked, maybe try it over there, you know. But just as often, a bootleg mine would be run by people who didn't really have much mining experience, and there'd be trouble. So there were a lot of accidents as well. And actually, so what you were saying though about writing petition, well, I forget how you said it, but lobbying, that's the word you used. That kind of was DIY too, and part of that same self-radicalization where they did try every available outlet. And I think that's, you know, generally part of organizing as a whole is like, okay, I think I know that doing this one thing is useless, but we need to do it so that everybody who's like on the fence can see that it's useless, you know? So like, also, while bootlegging was a quiet thing that they did at night, they were trying to work through the union. They were trying to work through the government. They were trying to work through the town. They were trying to find other work. People were leaving the region trying to find work elsewhere, but it's the Depression, you know? And so the kind of DIY in its way aspect of trying everything was also radicalizing.
Yeah, good point. Trying the proper channels is a part of the journey, I think. And I think another thing that I kept doing when I was reading the book was I kept jotting in the margin, like, so much like today. Oh my gosh, this is like today. You know, corrupt government offices, union leadership that talks more to industry than to its rank and file, violent cops that are, you know, either totally privatized or, you know, moonlighting as security for a company, legislating against the workers, et cetera, et cetera. And this is, of course, true and then not true at the same time, right? Because history doesn't really repeat, it echoes. And there was this feeling like, oh man, like it would be so cool. Because every time you read a radical book, you're always, well, at least I am, I'm always like, I wish we could do this. I wish this could happen today. And you answer this in the conclusion as well, but I'm curious, like you can never repeat something perfectly, but I'm curious what you feel with all of the research. Like, what do you feel that we could bring forward from the bootleggers? Because to me, it's more than a rad story. It's a suggestion. It's like a kind of a question that's like asking for an action. It felt like one to me. So what do you feel like their actions can most loudly echo in our place and time today?
Yeah, that is the hardest question. And I tried to write the book in the way where you could feel what they were feeling and see what they were thinking, because I'm hoping other people can come up with their own ideas about that. I mean, we could bootleg some coal, you know what I mean? But we got to leave that shit in the ground, like, honestly. And I've tried to look into cases around the world where similar things are happening currently. And there are a lot that are like comparable one way or another, but they're pretty much all resource extraction. So in terms of like the tactic of bootleg mining itself, that's really tough, you know. If it's really tough. The thing with the bootleg mines is they knew where it was, they knew how to get it, and they had people who would buy it, right? If this were bituminous coal, you couldn't do it because US Steel's not going to buy it from you, you know? So it's tough on that level. But there's all these ancillary movements. I'm trying that word out. I don't know if I've used that word before. I've only read it. Around the bootleg coal movement, though, that I think are a little more applicable. One is the equalization movement, where miners who have their mines shut down, they form these, I don't know, supra unions. Like, it's not the union itself. They open the union meeting and then close it right away, and then open a new meeting with the unemployed, right? And some local town leaders. And they would strike to make sure that everybody got equal work, right? So instead of the company laying off 50% of its employees, everybody would work half time. And if they were publishing the times in the newspaper, and so if one mine got ahead of everybody else, they would go on strike until the other ones opened. And the solidarity between the employed and unemployed in that is like, I don't know, can you measure solidarity? If you can, it's like a high measurement, right? It's impressive. And actually, some of these same towns tried that same strategy in the 50s, and it failed, and it left them very bitter, right? And so that's part of how forgetting works, though, in terms of tactics. You know, like you repeat things that worked for you before, not because they're a sure shot, but because you're like, oh no, I'm screwed. What can I do? I'll try the thing that worked that one time, right? And so a lot of the only people I could find who have like living memory of equalization like didn't want to talk about it. They're like, that was bad, you know, because they're remembering the 50s. But then another one, and I think this is a much more popular topic nowadays, is the unemployed organizing that the communists were doing. There were also socialists doing it, and they eventually merged, right? Where they were, you know, fighting to keep people in their homes, often literally, fighting to get people some kind of access to welfare, keeping people from getting their utilities shut off, things like that. And I try to delve into that organizing in the book too, because the bootleggers are part of this. They're part of Equalization, they're part of this, but nobody is coming out and saying, yeah, I'm in both, right? Except the open communists and socialists. But like, you know, neither, if you're already doing something like militant in the street, confrontational, nobody benefits by you being like, oh yeah, so I also run this illegal business over in the mountain, right? But so the unemployed organizing takes place at the same time, and it's really interesting. The communists ran it, but it wasn't that wasn't what it was about. Their goal for the Communist Party was to recruit new communists through it, but it was like a mass organization who anybody could join, and lots of people came in and out of it, you know, in when they needed help, out again, you know, after, like, when it's been a while, when I guess that kind of solidarity has been used up in them or something like that, you know, but then would come back again if they needed it later. So that's another type of organizing that's in there. There's also, I don't know, there's also a lot of cool collaborations between the textile unions, which are pretty much entirely women, you know, and the unemployed coal miners, who are, again, bootleggers. It's synonymous, even if they don't say it, there's a whole anti-strip mining movement at the time, which isn't environmentally based. It's based around people keeping their homes, and also strip mining means getting rid of underground mining jobs. Right. So it was kind of a dual employment and keep people in their homes kind of thing. And also they hated the dust, and it was bad, you know, but it wasn't in a larger environmental way. Yeah, but back to your original question, though, the bootleggers themselves, I'm hoping for some people to tell me, honestly.
Well, I mean, you did all the hard work of writing the book, so the least people could do is
Yeah, it's only fair.
So I do kind of want to talk about the elephant in the room, because you know, even though it's an elephant that wasn't really as prevalent in the early 1900s, the climate, as you said, like, it should stay in the ground. And I want to pull here from Terry Steele, who was a former miner who I spoke with in West Virginia. And he talks about this in my film. He said a lot of people come down to West Virginia and think that we don't know about climate change. And he's like, we do, which is another tangent, but the amount of people who come into rural communities and think that everyone's an idiot is just remarkable. But he said, you know, it's hard to get someone to understand something if it means understanding it, you'll be out of a job. And that's, of course, why it's so important for there to be infrastructure around a just transition, because, you know, I can't speak to Pennsylvania, but I know in West Virginia, there are coal jobs and then there's Walmart. And there's an ever dwindling amount of coal jobs, of course. But if your choices are between working in coal and working at Walmart, I think any one of us here would choose the coal because you're going to make enough to feed your family. And so the question of like, how are we going to make this transition has to be around, like, you can't just kill these jobs because then you're killing the people. And of course, the other part of it here is, you know, you mentioned nostalgia, and I think that that's a huge part of it. Like, at least in West Virginia, there's a feeling that when you say no to coal, you're saying no to the people, because they have so strongly intertwined their lives with coal that it's hard for them to think of a future without it. And so I'm curious here, like, if you can talk a little bit about, like, you know, this clash between like mad respect for these bootleggers and also like not wanting that to continue today. And just that issue of the elephant in the room and how you've grappled with that.
Yeah, it can be a tough line to walk. I've been surprised so far though, in doing events and things, how I'm trying to be explicit, like what these people did is badass, and also this isn't a rally for coal, you know? And I've been surprised that I haven't gotten any shit about that so far, you know? And also, like I said, there's still some independent miners and, you know, plenty of people I interact with who really like coal, you know? They say it's hotter. They say it burns hotter, which is a funny thing. It's because you can't turn it off, you know? Anyway, but you know, it is about their jobs. But the thing is, even if it paid the same, Walmart and a coal mine, a lot of people would still choose coal mine because there's a lot of pride in it, you know, because there's a lot of specialized knowledge and you using your skills, using your body, you know, it's hard to describe what it's like underground, particularly like modern mining that goes on in West Virginia and things like that. That's so mechanized, you know, that a lot of coal miners are more like underground computer operators, right? Anyway, maybe I'm getting a little off track. There's also the past 5 years, there's really not much coal mining anymore either, after a lot of the big companies have gone under. In any case, yeah, the way I think about it even today is like, we need to leave fossil fuels in the ground, but also as of this moment, you need to survive the winter. Like, coal is what's powering that. And so while I think we need to get off that ASAP, you know what I mean? People still put their lives on the line to keep your house warm. And I also don't want to disrespect that. Like, I want to respect that there is a lot of labor that still goes into it. And I don't know, maybe that sounds like bullshit, but that is actually how I feel about it. Because I'm not gonna like confront people about their own job, you know. That is just not gonna work. But I'm also not gonna lie to them, you know. I'm not gonna just pretend I'm one way, you know, when I'm not. But it's tricky. That's the whole thing. Now, historically, again, they're just so badass, and you can't like mix today and now. Like, oh, what if they were reading the internet every day about the new disasters happening all over the world because of the exhaust of what they're burning, you know? That's like, like like, you can't conjure a serious image of that enough to answer it. But there's one quote I have in the book that was the best of the interview quotes that I got on this question. So this guy, Andrew Drabitko, says, "I'd love to go out there and see all nice blue streams. I'd love to see all great big fish, nice green trees. But if my stomach is empty, my eyesight's not too good." In other words, I think there should be some way that everybody can work together, but unfortunately, we got one-sided. That's not good. And so what he's saying in the end of that quote is he wishes there were a way that they could have bootlegged coal that didn't destroy near as much as it destroyed, because the bootleg coal did destroy plenty. But it's another question that doesn't make sense to ask is how much did it destroy, because it's part of a larger mining industry, that has like been destroying things for a century and a half, so like Centralia, again, the burning town, right? That was a big bootleg coal miner hub. And they say that the maps of the coal mines under the town are like super incomplete, and that things are all like Swiss cheese down there. And that's part of what made the fire so hard to, well, they never did stop it. So made the fire unstoppable. That's certainly bootleg coal miners, and that's also certainly company mining. And you can't really separate them. Like any extractive industry, which we rely on for so much, even if we shouldn't be doing it, like just like the heat, like we rely on it for so much, and it has a huge cost, right? And a legacy. And I guess this isn't environmental, but I guess you could call it that. But part of the legacy with bootleg mining specifically is abandoned coal holes, right? And people falling in them. There were quite a few, like during this period, people, berry picking was really big seasonally, and a lot of people fell in holes berry picking, and years later, kids would be out playing and falling in. And it wasn't until like the 70s that there was like a really, like, I mean, a lot of miners would seal up their mines, but how well can you do it? And not everybody does it. It wasn't until like the 70s that there was a big like local movement for sealing those mines up so that people would stop falling in them, which was also a very DIY movement and cool, but that's a different book. So.
A sequel, perhaps. Yeah, no, I think that's there's like a lack of nuance, I think, in a lot of spaces in our world today. And I think particularly with these issues, there has to be nuance. And one of the things that another person said to me in West Virginia is like, please don't yell at the miners. They're not the ones who made the equipment. They're not the ones who profit off of mining, really. It's Wall Street and it's these big companies, and when they go belly up, the miners don't get shit. So it's like the miners are on your side, and I think again, like, that nuance is important. It's like we should be making friends with these people because we have the same enemies. And so, I mean, we have a little bit left before we switch over to Q&A, and I wanted to see if you could maybe pick a passage or two to read from the book to give people like a little bit of a taste.
Sure. Let me look through quick. The things I have highlighted are for the events I've done in Central PA, so not necessarily geared towards our firestorm crowd, who I actually don't know either. But I
think like something about like the radical organizing, the radical the DIY aspect, folks banding together to stop something, to stop the cops, to lend a hand to each other. That kind of stuff was for me super interesting and powerful.
Okay, I mean, here's a quote from a cop, right, who remains nameless. Well, I'll read the whole paragraph. It's about when they would arrest bootleg coal miners, when the company police would arrest people. The result of arrest were inconsistent, but bootleggers in Northumberland and Columbia counties were only typically charged with trespassing rather than theft. If found guilty, courts regularly issued fines of $1 to $10 with 6 months to pay it, under the clear implication that they'd be bootlegging coal to do that. One frustrated coal and iron cop lamented, "I've arrested a bootleg miner, taken him to court, seen him sentenced to jail, watched him put behind the bars. Then what? I walk down the street 10 minutes later and see him talking with his friends. They give me the laugh." Some jailers were even known to feed the bootleggers before sending them out the back door. So that gets at a lot, right?
I know, what a world where the jailers and some judges would be on your side. If I could have nostalgia for that, I would.
Yeah, it didn't feature too heavily in the book either, but there were also lots of company police who were on the bootleggers side, and so would do the bare minimum and dynamite coal holes in a way that they were easily reopened, things like that. Okay, so this is, I don't know if I said this explicitly in the book either, but the interviews I have, I think there's about 40 of them. Not one person would say they stole anything, right? They weren't stealing. So here's how this actually the same guy I quoted earlier, Andrew Drabitko, answers that question. Well, sure, supposedly they said it was their ground. Possibly it was their ground. You were stealing coal off their ground. When you got a bunch of hungry faces looking at you at the table, why you'd be surprised how your thinking changes. Right? Saying, maybe it was their land. Right?
Well, and I love that too, because I think you pointed out in the book that they decided that, their ability to feed themselves was more important than private property, which, I think that's such a simple and beautiful way of putting it. Like, of course it is. This is, I mean, that shouldn't even be a question, but it's something that's like enshrined in US colonialist history, and of course the present as well, is like private property. And so yeah, it's
yeah. The equalization movement ran into the same thing where it came down to that question. And it's cool that when I talk about this today in the region, like in this context, people still agree, like, yeah, if it comes down to profit or survival, like survival all the way, right? It's not even a question. So here's a longer passage that's pretty fun. Let's see if I need to explain what I'm reading first. Okay, so the Stevens Coal Company happened to move a large steam shovel to the massive Shamokin Edgewood tract. Until this point, bootleg miners throughout the region focused on mining small, steep coal veins that were unprofitable for companies to mine. Edgewood was the exception. The News Dispatch describes the tract, quote, "Estimates of the number of men employed in the mine holes on the Edgewood tract vary. All miners interviewed agreed that at least the number is at least 1,000. Some of the men think that at least 1,500 are at work," end quote. Those numbers are unlikely, but it was certainly over 500. One miner told the newspaper, quote, "No market for Shamokin coal. Hell's bells, we can't mine enough. There's more coal going out of these holes than we could taken from a good-sized mine, yet the truckers are yelling for more," end quote. That's part of an argument that the coal company should reopen so that they can stop bootleg mining. The description of the track is incredible. Quote, "Shaft towers rear above the trees in an endless row. Most of them are built from untrimmed timber, pieced together and braced in a more or less primitive fashion. They shake as the improvised buckets come to the surface, but they stand through all that. The men built improvised fans, some from wooden planks on a car engine, and link the mines underground for ventilation. Vent pipes from the fans to the underground present a variety of rain spouting, stovepipe, rubber hose, and old automobile tube tires. The miners had committees that settled disputes and collectively hired a night watchman. They even had their own mine inspector. Each coal hole was checked weekly." Okay, so I'll continue. Stevens announced that it would strip the tract and destroy the bootleg mines. The company said that once stripping was done, it would be they would open an underground mine on the property and re-employ hundreds. The bootleggers believed that to be far-fetched. Stephen tried to bring in the power shovel the next morning, but bootleggers poured out of the mountain and surrounded the shovel before it entered the woods, forcing the company to move it back into town. Both sides regrouped. The shovel returned to the tree line along with Stevens' superintendent, George Jones, and a state trooper, but the bootleggers had built a blockade of fallen trees, rocks, and rubble. Again, the shovel retreated, but this time the miners followed. According to the shovel operator, one bootleg miner asked him, "Do you stand to lose anything if something happens to that shovel?" He did. He was a subcontractor who owned the shovel. Then they asked, "Is it insured?" The operator says it was. "All right, then, get your men the hell out of the way. We're going to blow that shovel to hell." This is a quote from the newspaper. Hundreds of angry miners crowded around the machine, several attacking it with hammers and axes. Finally, 15 sticks of dynamite were placed under the motor and a firing wire and explosives attached. A few minutes later, there's a terrific blast and the shovel was reduced to a tangling mass of wreckage. And then, nothing. Reportedly 2,000 people were at this is my words now. Reportedly 2,000 people were at the scene when the dynamite went off that December afternoon. The mangled corpse of the shovel sat as a monument in Edgewood for some time, the few functional parts salvaged by its owners. Stevens Coal Company had little response. This must have driven them mad, but they recognized that there were thousands of men out there with dynamite, and Stevens had much more to lose than a subcontracted steam shovel. That winter of 1934 started out quite warm, and what would have been a series of blizzards was instead a terrible downpour of rain. The next few weeks left the Edgewood coal holes flooded, halting all work. 6 bootleg miners made their way to Superintendent Jones's office at Stevens Coal. Would he mind, they asked, loaning them a water pump to clear their minds?
I love that so much.
It's probably my favorite section of the whole thing. Yeah.
It's beautiful. It's very chef's kiss. Well, and for folks watching, that is a small sampling, but the whole book is, I mean, it's an adventure read, and it's also so inspiring and really radical, and I'm very glad to have had a chance to read it. So thank you so much, Mitch, for taking all the time to write the book and for sharing the history that is a part of your region and a part of you.
Thank you. And thank you, Eleanor. And anybody watching probably doesn't know that she's in Sweden and it's 3 a.m. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for bringing your insightful questions and fostering this discussion, letting Mitch tell his story and tell the story of others in this region. So we really appreciate you being here tonight. And hope you get some good rest.
Well, thank you so much. I'm glad to be here, and it's only 2 a.m. so let's not exaggerate.
Of course.
And thank you, everyone, and be well and stay as safe as you can out there.
Great. So we'll say bye to Eleanor, but for anyone who's still here, if you've got questions, I'm happy to moderate some questions to Mitch here. I know we already have one comment in the Q&A, which I will read out, but if anybody else has any questions, now is the time to ask. So Mitch, there's a comment in the Q&A. Stephen says, Mitch, I love the book. Is there a preferred way to contact you? Because it sounds like they are with some folks in Sheboygan, if I pronounced that wrong, my apologies, the Sheboygan area, and are currently planning community workshop events. And it would be great to have you speak there. It's the kind of organic organizing that you discuss in the book. So what's the best way for folks to contact you?
Hell yeah. In general, people contact me through the website bootlegcoal.com, but Stephen, your username is your email. I'll hit you up. Definitely want to hear what you're doing. And I've been looking for a spot to talk in Shamokin. Talked to a few people and it's fell through. And I also refuse to do bars again. I did some events at bars, don't need to repeat. So anyway, yeah, excited to hear what you're up to. So I'll be in touch.
Awesome. I love to see connections happening here. That's really exciting. I will say, Mitch, we talked a little before the event, but I'm curious to hear what the reception to the book has been like. It sounds like you've done a few events, and you were kind of talking about phases and really starting locally to where the book takes place. So I'm wondering, what has the reception been like? How have folks, what kind of feedback have you heard? What's that process been like?
Yeah, phase one of like the book finally being out is doing events in the towns that it's about. Setting that up can be a little tough because there's not a lot of bookstores, and I don't know, if I were a band, it'd be easy. People know what bands do and what kind of space they need and what to expect from them, you know, but people do not for books, and I'm also making it up too. So, you know, it's been a little tough to nail down sometimes. But yeah, so far the events have mostly been like well attended. A lot of people come with stories, sold a lot of books. Yeah. let's see. Yeah, again, not a lot of bookstores. And so phase 2 for me is to try to get the books sold in local places that aren't bookstores, right? Like neighborhood corner stores or just anywhere that's kind of a neighborhood or community kind of place, right? And once again, that's kind of tough because we sell hoagies, not books. How's this work? You know? But I'm working on that. But I'm also really excited to do events like this one and others in the future that are in more explicitly radical spaces or sharing what I'm doing with people elsewhere. But the reception has been really great. I was saying to you that my mom had told me, oh, do you remember so-and-so? But I didn't. She said, oh, you know, he's in his 80s. He just finished the book, but he said he has one problem with it. And I'm like, oh, okay, here we are. Been waiting for it. What's it going to be? You know, what's the thing somebody can't swallow? Well, it's that I wrote somebody's last name wrong in the acknowledgements. So so that's pretty good. I mean, actually, the guy whose name I messed up shouldn't have, but you know, but that's pretty good. But I've talked to a lot of people who have read some of it. Really excited to talk with more people, especially locally, who've read all of it, and see what their thoughts are.
Yeah, you know, folks care about the book when they're reading the acknowledgements, so I think it's a good sign. There's another person who just asks, is wondering if you have any plans for a next book or if you're working on any other projects.
Oh, that's a sweet question. Not really. I mean, I didn't intend to write a book in the first place until I had so much material that it was just, you know, and it's an untold story. But the thing about this book is I don't remember if it was mentioned, but I'm a descendant of the bootleg miners. Didn't know it until I started it. But even without knowing that, you know, I'm from this area, and there's a reason that I could write this book, right? So I really don't see myself writing a history of you know, somebody else's area or somebody else's stuff like that. So I don't know. I mean, I continue to write. I'm also with a group called Anthracite Unite, which mostly is a blog. Sometimes it kind of morphs into little campaign mode community organization. Yeah, the Anthracite Unite is it's been a pretty successful project. So the thing with the anthracite region is you know, you have Scranton and Wilkes-Barre way up top, but otherwise it's pretty rough and pretty sparse. You know, a lot of the towns have way more housing than they have people, and there's like tons of cool people, but a lot of people, like, they want to, you know, they move away and they want to come back home. They come back home for a few years and then they bounce again, right? And then we're always missing each other. And Anthracite Unite has been for years running this blog where we put out like, you know, radical political assessments of what's going on, calls to action, things like that, but also just cultural stuff, things people want to share, whatever. It's really all inclusive in a lot of ways, and also try to get diverse voices in there. And that's been a great way of connecting people. So for instance, when the Black Lives Matter stuff set off during the pandemic, right, we were able to pretty quickly help these new groups that were forming overnight link up, right? Because we already had people in all those different areas, so we could help make those connections. And so I don't know, continue work with that group. Otherwise, I don't know. I'm looking for projects. a lot of local people want me to write a sequel to this book, but nah, I want first somebody else's turn, you know?
Yeah, I mean, maybe you'll hook up with Steven there in Sheboygan and see what happens. Sounds like they've got some organic organizing happening. But yeah, that Anthracite Unite sounds also like a fantastic project, keeping folks connected. So if there's no more questions, I dropped in the chat there a link to the book if you've not picked it up yet, The Bootleg Coal Rebellion. Mitch, thank you so much for taking time to share this with us tonight. It was really a wonderful event.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't spent as much time on Zoom as a lot of people through the pandemic, so it's still like kind of novel to me that I can do an event with a bookstore in a state that I've never been to, you know? So hopefully one day would love to see the bookstore, you know?
That would be fantastic. Another project in the future come down, and yeah, we'll be in our new space by then. So you can come check it out, spend some time with us. I think that'd be really great.
Awesome. Yeah. All right. Thanks,
Awesome.
Ash.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks to everyone who came tonight, and thanks for your great questions and contributions. Everyone who registered will get a follow-up email with a recording, so you can watch the event again and share it with friends. Yeah. All right. Well, I hope everyone has a good night.
Bye.
Goodbye now.